Is history dead? That is the question posed by an article out recently from the Free Press, and it's an issue that I feel really strongly about, and I want to address it on the Know Why podcast, because it really has to do with how younger generations, millennials, especially Gen Z, and now we're looking toward Gen Alpha, it's how they're getting information online, and the way that they are getting information, getting news, is all affecting their worldview and what they believe about certain things. And what we're finding is that in this age of social media algorithms and AI bots that are going online and just disseminating so much false information, people are caring less and less about what's factually true. And this is a problem, but we can know it's a problem. We can worry about it. But how do we actually deal with it? And I'm not sure that I have the complete answer to that, but I do know of some places that I want to recommend where we can start. But first, let me take you through this article from the Free Press. It's called The Death of History by Niall Ferguson and John Clark Levin. I will link it so that you can read it for yourself. And it's kind of a long read, about 30 minutes, but I highly recommend that you read the article or listen to it if you want to go deeper into what that they are saying. But they are specifically talking about the rise in anti-Semitism. And one thing that I want to make perfectly clear is on the Know Why podcast, you will never hear any anti-Semitism from me or baseless conspiracy theories about the nation of Israel. That doesn't mean that people can't have critical opinions on the current government of Israel or what the IDF is doing. But so often people use that as just a Trojan horse. Sorry, I saw the Odyssey last night, for sneaking in what really does become conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. And we are seeing that. We are seeing, and no Trojan horse about it, no sneakiness, people blatantly saying that they hate the Jews and spouting off these conspiracy theories that people maybe naively thought were dead, but have been repeated for literally thousands of years. It's the oldest conspiracy theory out there. And I'm just not going to tolerate it because I think it's wrong. When we were kids, if you were like me, we would watch a historical movie or documentary. Maybe we went to a Holocaust museum on a field trip. Maybe we read a story about the abolition movement during the Civil War, or people who hid Jewish children from Nazi soldiers. And maybe you were like me and you would put yourself in the shoes of the character that you were reading about or watching a movie about. And you would say, would I be brave enough to do that? Would I stand up against that? And we tell ourselves, of course we would. We would be on the right side of history. Well, we are in a situation now where we have the opportunity to be on the right side of history. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that sometimes, many times, questions of right and wrong feel murky. That doesn't mean they always are murky, but it can feel murky. It can feel unsure. You can say, well, is this really an issue? Or I don't know. People, it's really easy to just kind of be lulled into comfort instead of recognizing when something's really wrong and when it's time to speak up. And so I think a lot of times we flatter ourselves, honestly, by thinking that we would have been this bold defender of justice back in some other time when we're often not even seeing our own times very clearly. And so one issue that we are seeing come up again, of course, is, like I said, the anti-Semitism. And this is the time for us to say something about it and speak up clearly and make sure that we are telling people in our sphere of influence, especially kids that we're raising or around, we can really influence them in a positive direction, and not objective or subjectively positive, but the truth, because the truth can be found. There's a study out, I think it was from Barna, I'll link it here, that said the majority of Gen Z does not think that moral absolutes exist, or they think that morality changes over time. But that is false, because if morality changes over time, then maybe slavery was okay back in the day because everybody was okay with it. Nobody was speaking up against it until some people did speak up against it. Maybe the Holocaust wasn't actually that bad, which is what people are explicitly arguing now. You can go and see all these examples. And do you really believe that? Do you really believe that morality changes over time and that there are no moral absolutes? Or do you believe that there are some things that are always wrong and always right? I believe there are things that are always wrong and always right. And I think that it comes from the truth of God's word. And that's really where we find our moral absolutes. I think people can recognize moral absolutes while maybe not even accepting the full religion of the Bible, which is Christianity. But I think that eventually, if you go back far enough to try to figure out where it comes from, you're going to end up at God. So anyways, that's my intro spiel of why I think this matters and why I think it is so important for us right now. But let's dig into the problem. So we know that you have everybody from Myron Gaines to Tucker Carlson to Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and others that I'm not even aware of, who have been perpetuating everything from skepticism to outright, bold, proud anti-Semitism and Jew hatred in kind of the online sphere and podcast sphere at different, varying levels, varying degrees. It's really just become more common on the right and the left to be okay with this. And we shouldn't be. We should not be okay with this. We should not be okay with the conversation going in that direction. I'm all for free speech, but if we're going to allow free speech, that means that we have to be willing to combat the bad ideas and call them out instead of just trying to ignore it or brush it under the rug when it's on our own side. And we have to understand how powerful these influences are, especially to younger people. So as they talk about being, writing this article from the perspective of a historian, is that in the past, Holocaust denial was kind of seen as something that was easy to dismiss. It was not in the mainstream at all. It wasn't cool. You didn't want to be associated with it. So while you did have people who denied the Holocaust even happened, or that maybe they said it was overblown in history books and things like that, which is all easily dismissible, by the way, then, it wasn't really that big of a deal because it wasn't influencing mainstream society. But it's kind of changed over time. So they talk about how there's been a kind of a rise in Holocaust denial again. So not too long ago, you had Daryl Cooper, who claims to be a historian but really isn't, on Tucker Carlson's podcast, which is an extremely popular podcast, especially among people who are on the political spectrum on the right. And this is where he was talking about basically just revising and retelling everything that happened during World War II, making Churchill out to be the villain, saying that, Hitler's concentration camps, like they weren't that brutal. They didn't really mean to kill that many Jews. They just ended up dead because the Nazis didn't realize the logistics of caring for so many prisoners. So rather than let them starve, they actually just humanely killed them. I'm sorry, there are actual photographs of people who were not only abused and tortured, but starved to death as well. So they were starved and then they were executed. There's literally just no reality in which this is a true interpretation of history at all. But when you push back on it, typically the defense is, I'm just asking questions, or I'm for free speech, or I'm not going to cancel somebody because they said something offensive. It's kind of this excuse of removing what's called the Overton window, which is basically kind of some boundary lines of what in polite society you're allowed to discuss or what is acceptable conversation. And so usually that can kind of be an explanation or a justification of, I'm being provocative on purpose because I'm trying to move the Overton window, or I'm just asking questions. Why are we, and now this is weird. Oh my gosh, why are you pushing back? Why am I not even allowed to ask questions about this? I'm just investigating. And it's all a straw man argument to basically say that people who push back are suppressive or they're, trying to cancel or censor. And in reality, it's just people pushing back and saying you're wrong. And so when somebody is doing that, like no one's being deplatformed, you're not talking about anybody who's being cut off the air or anything like that. But when people push back and criticize, you can't just say, oh, I'm being canceled. No, that's what free speech is. If you want to say crazy stuff, then you can expect people to respond to it. And that's all free speech, okay? So, but it gave kind of people a defense. Well, now we've gone even beyond that, okay? So this is where the article kind of explains like this new iteration of Holocaust denial, which really isn't even denying that factually it happened. It's really a moral change or a moral sensibility change in caring that it happened at all. Basically, it doesn't matter that it happened, or even it was good that it happened. And so this is where you see the Nick Fuentes people and the Myron Gaines people and very popular online platforms who are charismatic and personable, maybe in kind of different styles, both of those examples, and the way that they appear to people, and they are come across as very confident, but they're not really arguing anything coherent. This is a really insightful paragraph that I will read from the original article from the Free Press. They're talking about viewers of Fuentes specifically. When you ask one of them to explain Fuentes' ideas, the answer is usually hopelessly vague. You've just got to watch for yourself, they reply, attaching a video longer than Lawrence of Arabia. For listeners who don't know what that is or have never watched it, it's an old movie and it's almost 4 hours long. They go on. This is a tell, a sign that the true attraction isn't evidence or arguments, but instead the emotions Fuentes arouses. If you watch a 3-hour lecture about history or science, you can summarize the key points to a friend, even if you can't recall every detail. By contrast, there are no summarizable takeaways from performances like a Fuentes show. He gleefully spouts the N-word and unfurls slur-laced harangues against transsexuals, gays, Muslims, Indians, blacks, Jews, and women, language his white male listeners know would get them fired. Often, the offensiveness is unmoored from any ideology at all, like Fuentes' recent declaration that child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein was cool as blank. The posture is that he's freeing his audience, especially incels or involuntarily celibate Zoomer men, from all the norms they resent. Wrapping up the quote, the main point isn't to convince people of that factual claim. It's to make them reject the topic as unworthy of moral concern altogether and paint those who care about Nazi atrocities as cringy, out-of-touch scolds. This is really important. Don't miss this. Don't skip over this. That the attraction of this new kind of, I'm not even going to say edginess because that's what they're trying to portray it as, but really anti-truth propaganda is basically that there is no truth. You are being offensive for the sake of being offensive. You don't have a moral code. This kind of new strand is just unmoored from any ideology. It's just tear down all the norms, throw out the baby with the bathwater, say something as offensive as possible. We don't really care, and if you care, then you're a part of the joke. What's the worldview in that? There really isn't any. But it is something that for some reason is attractive to a frighteningly large amount of people. So how is this getting perpetuated? That's a huge part of this, and a lot of it has to do with algorithms. And we have known this for a long time, so this part shouldn't be surprising, but you may not be aware of exactly how hard algorithms are pushing young people, and I think particularly young men who are on the right politically, down this rabbit hole of blatant anti-Semitism. So we all know that algorithms look at everything you do online. When you are on a social media platform like YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, even the amount of time that you pause, like milliseconds over a picture or a video in the middle of your scroll, is documented. And that affects what kind of videos that you are shown next or what kind of content you're shown next. Remember, the whole goal of social media companies is to keep you engaged as long as possible because you are the product. They need to keep you engaged so that you'll spend as much time as possible on their apps so that you will see ads, and that's how they make money, is by keeping people engaged. It's the same for AI companies, by the way. Just remember that if a service is free, it's not actually free. That just means that you're actually the product. So your attention is the product on these algorithms. So everybody knows that, well, at least everybody who has an understanding of journalism and human attention, that if it bleeds, it leads, meaning our attention is drawn to like the most extreme, the most graphic, the worst case news. That's why it's common for people who do have platforms like a podcast to be doomeristic, so to speak, and to say, oh, the sky is falling, this is horrible, it's the worst thing ever, because that draws people in. That's why the whole saying, if it bleeds, it leads, is a saying in the first place, because that's going to grab people's attention. If there's a horrific car wreck or something like that, front page material on the local newspaper. So that's why it works the same way on the algorithms. The more extreme, the more offensive, the more on edge the content is, even if somebody isn't watching in an approving way, it's just kind of our eyes and our attention are drawn to what is shocking. it's going to continue to give you more of that content. And that is how so many people get siloed into these extreme echo chambers and conspiracy theory realms. And you look at someone maybe that you've known for a long time and you're like, when did they start believing all this stuff? And it just seems out of the blue. I would almost guarantee you, if I was a betting person, and I'm not, I would bet money on the fact that online content has had something to do with it. And there are multiple stories over the past decade of this kind of thing playing out in real people's lives because of algorithms. Well, then you have to now add AI into it. So there are multiple ways that AI contributes to this, but one of the ways that I want to focus on is these bots. And I thought, again, the authors of this article made a really important point. And you've probably seen it too. If you do spend any time on these, cursed apps like Instagram Reels or X or whatever, and you see a post and, it's like human nature. It's hard to resist. You're like, let's look at the dumpster fire that is the comment section and see, are people being normal today? And then the answer is always no. It's always no. Of course they're not being normal today. And a lot of it is because they're not people. They're AI bots. And if you realize that, and if you teach your kids that or teach your teens who are on these platforms, it can really open eyes, because otherwise, say there's something where somebody is, being edgy, or they're saying something they're not supposed to say, they're saying something offensive and they're just asking questions, or they're saying that, it really is all the Jews' fault, or the the Holocaust didn't actually happen, the Nazis were the good guys, or we should just kill all the Jews anyways. Those are things that people are actually saying. I can link clips, but I don't want to do that. But these are arguments that are out there on social media that people are seeing. If someone goes to the comment section to kind of and we also do that to gauge what's the response. We're social beings, right? I think that's kind of common. We want to see read the room. We want to see, does the crowd agree with this or not? And we give into peer pressure. So if the comment section is flooded with messages affirming whatever the grotesque message of that video was, it can kind of give the impression that this should be normalized. This is common. Oh, everybody else must be right. And if you are the poor soul that thinks you're going to sit there and type out the truth in a response in the comment section on a TikTok video or an Instagram reel or a YouTube short or an X post, you're going to lose. You are fighting a losing battle, because nobody cares about whether or not it's factually true. We know this by looking at the worldview of young people today and just the standard worldview in our culture. First of all, nobody believes in absolute morals anyways. And that's just not how it works online. I mean, people are looking at 30-second or less clips saying something shocking and getting an emotional reaction from that, and then looking at the next thing that the algorithm has to give them. And that is how the majority of young people today are getting their news and their information. And so, of course, you can't fight all of the AI bots with facts and truth, because if people are so cynical that they think that everything is rigged, and if they don't believe that there is any truth or that truth can be found, if you are living in a society that's completely unmoored from a moral grounding, any sort of moral foundation of this is right, this is wrong, and everybody's just so disenfranchised to the point that they just want to tear it all down and offend whoever they can in the process, then they're not going to accept the facts you present anyways, because they would probably find some reason to not believe them. If you are so removed from any sort of trust in any sort of system, then it's easy for you to say, well, I just dismiss that evidence, and you don't trust anything. That's why I've done an episode on conspiracy theories before, that from a Christian perspective, it's actually not biblical to be swept up in conspiracy theories, because at the root of that is such a distrust that you are actually saying that really you can't find any truth. And so it's much easier, instead of presenting evidence in the way that a civilized society has typically looked at evidence and judged what's true and what's false, instead of going through the trouble to do that, it's a lot easier to just be like, well, I don't like that outcome, or I'm a little bit suspicious about that, or I don't understand it, so I'm just going to say it's a conspiracy and I'm going to come up with some other crazy explanation, but I'm not actually going to go through the trouble to prove it because I don't trust the system anyways. It's just such a fantasy land, really, to inhabit. But unfortunately, I think we have a lot of young people who are inhabiting that fantasy land, and other people too, because they're getting swept up and they're not realizing how much the algorithms and the bots are actually impacting what they see and what they believe. And it's not real. It's not the real world. Like we've been saying that for a long time. The internet isn't the real world. Social media isn't the real world, even more so now with AI. And so if you have any skepticism, or if you are talking to a young person who maybe is caught up in this world and they have any measure of skepticism at all about AI, then tell them that this is a problem. Like, you're right. You should mistrust it. And the prevalence of AI on these platforms should make you question whether or not what you're seeing is actually true, or if it's being fed to you by an algorithm and then amplified by AI bots. So what's way better is getting offline and then choosing multiple different sources that existed before social media and AI could generate anything, and then evaluating with your own mind and your own critical thinking skills. That is where people need to go to find the truth, not relying on online stuff. Okay, so anyways, there's a lot here. I didn't want this to be a super long episode, but there are multiple examples. I just urge you to read this article because there are multiple examples of how insidious and even subtle a lot of this extreme content is getting and how normal it's getting. And this is kind of a wake-up call, I think, for people who maybe aren't realizing just how bad this is. All right, young Americans have become much more anti-Semitic than their elders, with 18% of 18 to 22-year-old voters saying the Jewish community has had a negative impact on the United States, compared with around 6% of those age 45 and older. Although both far left and far right radicals are much more likely to hold such views than the general population, the horseshoe is not symmetrical. Those ages 18 to 34 were asked whether they agreed with at least one of a series of anti-Semitic statements, such as Jews in the United States have too much power. Among extremely conservative voters, 64% agreed with one or more of those statements, compared to just 34% of those who are extremely liberal. They end by saying the Fuentes effect on this age bracket is clear. Older, extremely conservative voters were not significantly more anti-Semitic than the overall electorate. They say, we face, in short, the gravest challenge yet to the West's commitment of free speech, an AI-powered assault on historical truth. So that really lays out the stakes here. It's about anti-Semitism. It's about combating that even when the job seems super difficult and you know that you are up against very powerful algorithms and artificial intelligence and bots and AI agents that can do more in seconds to perpetuate lies than you can even hope to combat within a few minutes or days. But that doesn't mean that we stop fighting the good fight. And this is, while that is a super, super important aspect of this affects everything too. Because anti-Semitism is really high right now because, again, we live in the conspiracy theory age where people are so disenfranchised, I think, and so distrustful of systems and so unmoored from any reality that they're trying to make sense of the world. And so as a society, it's like collectively everybody was just like, let's revert back to the oldest conspiracy theory in history, which is blame the Jews for everything. Like literally, read world history, read European history, read Christian history. This is the scapegoat. This is what people always want to blame. They want to blame the Jewish population. And it is a real close link between blaming Israel for everything and giving Israel like this undue credit for influencing United States political and foreign policy, and then just being outright anti-Semitic. Like it's real close. So again, that's not saying that criticizing the Israeli government is anti-Semitic, but most people who are arguing that are real close to just becoming like outright anti-Semitic anyways. So this is an issue because of that issue alone. It's important enough. But if we live in a post-truth era where nobody's believing anything, they don't believe anything matters, they're open to appeals to their emotions and their feelings rather than statements of fact because they don't believe in facts or they don't believe they can trust any of the facts, then everything that is true is at risk. And you have a society of young people who are just floating in what? In nothing, because they don't have any moral grounding. So again, like I said, I'm not some guru here with like the big answer, but I do think that there are some steps we can take, and I'm particularly thinking about parents because that's what season of life I'm in. And so those of us who are young enough to be online and understand that, but not young enough to have been completely raised online. So we still have a little bit of more of a tether to the real world because our entire childhood wasn't online. I think that the burden really lies on us now with like, okay, how are we going to raise the next generation? We see the problems that are taking place with like teens and young adults right now. Our kids are just a few years behind that. So what do we do about it? Well, one of the things that I think we really need to do that's super important is to participate in the tech exit. So that is a term coined by Claire Morrell, who wrote a book, and I've talked about the book. I've interviewed her on Point of View. I will link that interview again in the book. Any parent today has to read it. Okay, so the tech exit, the way that Claire Morrell describes it, is no smartphones, social media, tablets, or video games during childhood. Because of the negative influences that these things have on kids' brain development, on their social development, and now I would add on their development of any ability to think critically or have some sort of moral grounding and understanding of what's true and false. If they are raised in this algorithm-driven, AI bot riddled environment online, and that's where they're spending most of their attention during childhood, then that's going to be their worldview, which is a worldview where there is no truth, there is no right or wrong, there is no time to think, because 30 seconds later or less, you're on to the next video. And so it is like, of course, our younger generations are being driven by emotion because they're not given time to think if that's where they're spending their time. Again, read The Anxious Generation, read The Tech Exit. Look at those websites. There's websites for both books, and they have all of the data on how smartphones and algorithms and social media are negatively impacting our kids. So while they're young, while they're under your roof, keep them out of that. It's becoming easier to do that because of the pushback, because so many parents have seen the negative impact this has had on their kids, and you have like bell-to-bell cell phone bans being passed in schools across the nation. You have even other countries that are banning social media for kids under a certain age. You have states and countries that are getting rid of ed tech and going analog with pencils and papers and real textbooks again. Like, there is a movement toward this. So I think for those of us raising kids now, if this trend continues, it's only going to be easier to like have workarounds that don't make you just a freak show of like, well, we're not doing any tech in our house. I think that's going to be more common. I think we're already seeing that. But I think that's really important, probably for the number one reason from my perspective, is so that I can actually teach them what truth is. Because truth exists in the real world, but right now it does not exist in the online world that so many kids are spending their time on, unfortunately. And again, just another facet of that is when they're on these devices and they're on social media, which are driven by these algorithms, really their behavior is driven by the dopamine hits. So everything about the way the smartphone and social media apps are designed is to give users dopamine hits over and over to literally make them addicted so they keep coming back. So when they become addicted to this digital dopamine, and not only are they driven into more and more extreme content, but then they're getting the dopamine hit by using it, again, it's crippling their ability to think critically or separate them from that at all. So I think the tech exit is key to actually just like teaching the next generation what truth is. I think we need to also normalize and actually demand reading books in your family, read books in your household, read about history and discuss it. So find good resources. I love a primary document, right? Like, the closer you can get to the event that actually happened and read sources around that, I think in general, the better. But there are so many great sources out there on history. If you make reading is becoming a lost skill, unfortunately. But if you demand like 30 minutes or an hour of reading time a day, once your kids are able to do that, and when they're younger, read to them. Like, it might not be easy, but you can't normalize something if you don't start, and then it becomes normal. So we need to normalize reading books, and for parents, I'm talking to myself, They got to see you reading too, not looking at your smartphone or your device, but normalize reading books, normalize studying. If you have a question, don't let them see you always going to Google or, God forbid, Chat GPT. And you know how I feel about that. You can go back but seriously, like all jokes aside, don't let them see you going to a digital device first. Like, get a set of encyclopedias, get some dictionaries, get some other books, go to the library. If you read Harry Potter, what does Hermione always say? Let's go to the library. That's great. Normalize that again. Because again, it may seem like a small thing, and it may seem like, well, that's just related to literacy skills or whatever, but what it's actually doing is giving kids the tools to find out truth. Not every single book they read is going to have the truth. There are a lot of books out there that contain lies too, but if they don't even have the mental stamina to read a whole book and then maybe read a counter argument in the form of a whole book and then compare the two or read a few more on a topic to get like an overall picture, then they're never going to be able to find the truth. But if we have attention spans that are so shot that college students at Harvard are struggling to even read one book written in 1962 without translating it into more modern English through ChatGPT, and yes, this happened, I'll link the Atlantic article, then how do we expect people to really form a comprehensive view of anything? So we have to normalize reading books, discussing history in the home, discussing important issues, and going to real sources for information, not just looking online all the time. And then, of course, as I'm coming at this from a Christian perspective, we have to teach a biblical worldview to our kids. They have to know that because they're going to encounter the lies, whether anti-Semitism is still raging by the time they reach adulthood or some other lie, many other lies. Then they have to be grounded in what is true before they even encounter that. And that means there is truth, there is goodness, and there's good and bad, there's good and evil. You can find truth. Human beings are inherently valuable. There's no one class or race or group of people who are more inherently valuable than another. There is no group of people that is more sinful inherently than another. And so any kind of ideology or prejudice that tries to claim that is automatically unbiblical. And therefore, not Christians can't believe it. Like, you can't be a Christ follower and then believe that a certain group of people is like inherently less than. You just can't. It's not in the Bible. That's not compatible with Christianity. And so we need to be telling kids that intentionally from a young age. And I know sometimes as parents we want to shelter our kids, but if they have friends that have the internet, and as much as you try to do to protect them, they're going to encounter the lies. So isn't it better that they encounter the truth first? Kids are smart. They're going to know good and evil exist from a pretty early age. So you can teach them that within the proper framework, from teaching them a biblical worldview and then teaching them how to recognize what is good. Because before very long, whether we want them to or not, they will encounter what is evil, and they need to be very well acquainted with the truth and with what is good so that they can counter the evil and the darkness and the lies. So for people who maybe are like, well, I've got somebody that's already like in this environment, then, you got to pray for them. If you're in any sort of position to recommend or facilitate like a digital detox, I think that that's really important, especially because I don't think we can like separate in this post-truth era, like the anti-Semitism issue in particular with the algorithm and the AI bots. We have to realize how ingrained those lies are in those systems and how easily they can facilitate lies, how easily they can separate us from any sort of moral grounding in what is true or not. So if you can do a detox, you can. Recovering the attention span, and you can do it. Neuroplasticity, you can reform your brain physically. You can create new pathways in your mind. You can form new habits. So if a habit is broken or was never formed to begin with, it might be hard as an adult, but it can be done. So people need to rebuild our attention spans. Learn how to read a whole book again, and then it becomes easier and easier to do that. So if somebody isn't even at a place where they can deal with like the attention span of sitting down and reading a real historian's take, like a real historian's book, not some 4-hour rant on Rumble that's not making any coherent arguments. If they can build up to that, then it's going to change the way they think, because they're not just going to be getting fed online slop and clickbait and rage bait and things that stroke, the disenfranchisement that they already feel, but actual thoughts. And so when you can get people to kind of realize that they're being fed lies to keep them addicted to these screens and these devices and these platforms, just so that they can, for the engagement purposes, because they're the product, then they can realize, like, okay, maybe I should try to think independently on my own. And maybe just because someone says, oh, I'm asking questions, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the independent thinker in the room. Maybe they're just a grifter that's trying to exploit your attention. And that is exactly what's happening. So we have to stop this from taking root. We have to fight it when we see it. And then we have to really work to rebuild the era of truth. We have to work to make sure that we are giving our kids a worldview of truth, where there is good and bad, there is right and wrong, there is up and down, and they're not just floating in some world of untethered complaint and disgruntlement, and where they're just addicted to dopamine hits on their digital devices. And as bleak as that sounds, like, I think that's the reality that a lot of people are living in, unfortunately. And we have to fight it. And that means living in the real world and raising kids in the real world before they ever encounter all of the mess that is online and on the screens. So I'm going to wrap it up there, because I could keep ranting and I don't want this to turn into Lawrence of Arabia. But thank you for listening. If you agree with my concerns, then consider sharing this episode. Don't forget, I sometimes forget to mention this myself, but it would be really helpful if you left a rating or a review of the Know Why podcast, shared this with somebody, make sure that you subscribe wherever you listen, so that hopefully we can get the truth out there a little bit. Maybe we can't beat the bots, but for people who are truly seeking to learn more, I want people to be able to access that. So thanks for listening to the Know Why podcast, and I'll see you next week.